climate change is such a significant reality that I think it demands a lot of us potentially, and I wonder if our spirituality, our faith sometimes is up to the task even. At least sometimes I question that myself. What is it that I can draw on to maintain a sense of hope, purpose, direction in the midst of some of what's coming at us? But I'm excited to be with you all, and I'm grateful for the chance. Elias, thank you for the invite, and Larry for your hospitality. I've been in this work for over 15 years. I worked for Earth Ministry in Seattle for 11 years, which is an ecumenically Christian, faith-based eco-justice organization. And I worked for the National Episcopal Church for 4 years as Economic and Environmental Affairs Officer. And sometimes I wonder what I have left to say. Or what I have left to say. And that's sort of scary to think about coming and being asked to talk. So I toyed with the idea of just sitting down and we could be quiet for 45 minutes. Meister Eckhart, and it might be more powerful than anything we had to do otherwise. Meister Eckhart, I think, says there's nothing so much like God in all the universe as silence. So we could do worse than to be quiet together at times. I think that would be something that all of our spiritualities would probably point to as one place of hope. But I also think I was afraid that not even our spirituality, our faith, not even that which some of us hold most dear and most at our depths, will provide the strength, the motivation, and the wisdom to collectively pull ourselves away from what feels like a precipice at many times when I read the science. And then I'm afraid that, I don't want to offer false hope. Then that would be better, and that would be worse perhaps. Offering false hope would be worse perhaps than simply admitting that sometimes my level of hope is fairly small these days. And I guess I'm curious where you are on that scale, and I think later we'll do a little exercise so you can let one another know where you are in your quotient of hope, if you will. But as I was sitting in the plane yesterday, a wild thought occurred to me, and that was to start the talk by talking about sexuality. And I bet no one thought I was going to go there first, right? So, if nothing else, it gets our mind off of climate change, which is a nice break. So I just started teaching a class on sexuality and faith for 7th and 8th graders. Exactly. Let's just be quiet, right? Let's sit down, kids, and shut up. I'm not going to say anything, So we have 7 kids. And the curriculum we're using lasts 27 weeks for 90 minutes a shot. So we're going over a lot of stuff with these kids. And I grew up in a pretty conservative church, and then I went to an even more conservative college, Wheaton College in Illinois. And I had to sign something saying I would not drink, dance, or have sex. Wow. Shudders. What, about the drinking or what? No. So, and then there's a classic joke that Wheaties, and sometimes conservative Baptists tell about themselves. Why can't Wheaties, that's what Wheaton people call ourselves, why can't Wheaties have sex? Well, it might lead to dancing. So, so you might be wondering why I started out talking about sexuality. For one, there's a little bit of a break, a little bit of humor, but then I began thinking about it a bit more. And for me and my family's and church's silence, silence around sexuality and the deep and the mysterious ways that's part of who we are, and is actually a good part of who we are, rather than something to be ignored at best or seen as wrong or evil at worst. Even if I never did anything wrong and I was supposed to feel guilty about what? About something, right? Well, that silence actually harmed me and led to years of unnecessary wrestling with issues surrounding sexuality. So my faith community let me down. My spirituality became tied to what I now know as an inaccurate and life-denying view of sexuality, of the body, of feelings, of relationship. And so I now want to be one conduit in these 7th and 8th graders' lives of something much different than that and more positive. Their faith community gathering around them to talk openly about their sexuality and how it ties to their values and spirituality. I want to offer them something I know would have helped me a great deal, and I think would have helped me avoid a good deal of grief and anguish as I grew up. In a sense, I'm motivated by the desire that these kids not experience some of the woundedness that I experienced. I very much see my participation in this class, or my role in it, as a preemptive healer, if you will. Hopefully they won't have to go through some of the things I did. I see my role in Henry Nouwen's language as that of a wounded healer. Who knows, maybe in that role, some of my own wounds might be healed a bit more too. And I've always seen, most fundamentally, the work of faith-based eco-justice or faith-based climate change action as being a healing ministry. If someone asks me, what is it you do? I'll often say, well, hopefully, I'm part of being a part of the healing that people can experience in what I see as often a very broken relationship between ourselves and the rest of creation. And that's how I see all of you then. So I see you as courageous because you are wounded healers. Our best healers are those who themselves have been wounded, have not shied away from the pain of that wound, but rather turned into it and found a path through it. And you may not see yourselves as a wounded healer. That may not be part of your identity. But I bet that if you were to tell part of your story tonight, this afternoon, that one of the reasons and motivations behind your work and even being at this conference is that you love something about this beautiful gift of creation. And that at some point you realized we were not treating that gift so well, that sometimes you may not treat that gift so well. And in other words, there is some woundedness or some pain or some recognition of a relationship between you and a part of creation that has been torn in some way. And you so much desire to be part of the healing of that wound. Father Richard Rohr has said that the path of descent, not dissent, although he probably would say this too potentially, but descent, D-E-S-C-E-N-T, going down, is the path of transformation. Darkness, failure, relapse, death, and woundedness are our primary teachers, rather than ideas or doctrines. The healing of wounds requires that we travel the path of descent, I think. Father Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R, a Franciscan priest. He has a center called the Center for Action and Contemplation. Rohr says it is that path of descent that also leads to our own transformation, which is indeed the very good news in that message. And in a Navajo rug, apparently there's always an imperfection woven into the rug. And the Navajo believe that it is precisely through the imperfection that the spirit moves in and out of the rug. It reminds me of a Bruce Cockburn song, "My shadows, they follow me everywhere. Guess that means I'm moving toward the light." So welcome, wounded healers. Thank you for your courage. Do not be afraid, even of your own wounds, for as they are healed, you will be able to offer that healing to others. And I think people will recognize that in you and want to be with you because of that. So I guess I play a little game now that we play with the 7th and 8th graders. It's called values voting, where there's a continuum. We put out a continuum in the room. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. And then the middle would be neutral, and then you'd have sort of agree and sort of disagree. And we won't get up and do this, but I will ask you to stand. I'm going to have a statement. And with the kids, one of them might be, I think 13-year-olds should be allowed to go out, just, 2 people on their own without supervision. And then they put themselves on the continuum. Or if a teenage father should be made to pay for the child support, and they put themselves on the continuum, and then they talk to each other. And they try and figure out where they are on this continuum. And you can change places on the continuum. But I just want to read a statement to you. I am hopeful that our society will address climate change so as to avoid the worst impacts. So those of you who strongly agree that you're hopeful that we're going to do that, if you strongly agree with that, could you please, and again, you're going to have this continuum of 5 spots, strongly disagree and so on. So if you strongly agree, could you stand up? I am hopeful that our society will address climate change so as to avoid the worst impacts. You can stand up. Take a look around. Well, you can go with partly agree. You don't have to stand up yet. Right? Well, so look around and for those of you who are going to say strongly disagree, you might want to go talk with someone later who's standing up now. Okay, thanks. Those of you who are more here, like I somewhat agree with that. Okay. Okay, a good number chunk of you. Thank you. Look around. Well, here you're just not sure. You no idea at all. Couple. Okay, 3. Anybody here and I pretty much disagree with that?
Yeah, we need a contrarian in the group.
All right, thank you, Roger.
I was more hopeful, but
Yeah. So we've got 2 standing up in the disagree. And does anyone strongly disagree? Joe and Kathleen. I know these guys. We're going to have dinner later. Maybe I shouldn't. No, I'm just kidding. strongly disagree, these 2. Okay. So we have 3 or 4 people that are down on this end. And most of the rest of you were down here. That's hopeful to me. Where did you put yourself? Strongly agree. All right. I just went to his workshop, and the science just feels somewhat beyond me, but also overwhelming. And since you're, as a scientist down here, I'm kind of glad to hear that. Okay, now one more. Yeah.
I wonder whether that half over there is delusional.
Okay. Well, that's a question we could reasonably ask of ourselves. But
just open to miracles.
There you go. There you go. So how about one more? My spirituality and faith is a big part of that hope. Is a big reason why I have that hope. Or spirituality, faith feels kind of up to the task of meeting the realities brought on by climate change. So you could totally, be down here, but still feel like your faith and spirituality is what buoys you up still in the midst of that disagreement or lack of hope. So,
what if your lack of spirituality contributes to your hopelessness?
well, then maybe you want to leave right now. I don't know. No. I'm really glad you're here, Roger.
I'll find a way to stay.
Right. It could be that what's the opposite? Yeah. Your spirituality could, in other words, contribute to being kind of hopeless because you think it's sort of a part of a judgment thing. Yeah, there's lots of worldviews out there. So how about if you strongly agree that your faith and spirituality is part of what buoys you up and is giving you strength and hope these days? It's part of that hope you have. Okay? How about it? So about 20 or 15. How about right here? You somewhat agree with that. How about here? Okay, in the middle. Now, how about more toward the disagree? Okay. Anyone? Yeah. So, thank you. Way down here, yeah. I think I would just so you've been vulnerable, right? I'd probably be more down here on the lately the faith spirituality piece hasn't felt particularly strong to me. I'd probably be more down here, which is maybe one of the reasons I was nervous about coming to talk to you. And the hope piece, it really depends what day you ask me. It really does. So these are some things that I think spirituality, we might have some more time to talk about where you were on that if you like toward the end, but I want to move on into, there are some things we're going to go over in terms of what I think spirituality can offer, does offer, or has offered to me, and perhaps does to you in the context of climate change. And one is the facing of denial. Earlier when I read that, for me, my family and church's silence around all the deep and mysterious ways my sexuality was part of me, and that my faith community let me down, my spirituality became tied to what I now know was an inaccurate and life-denying view. In some ways, I think I could say, for me, my family's and church's silence around climate change or around relationship with all creation. The faith that I grew up with was very much focused on humans and human salvation. And the earth was, in a sense, a backdrop on which the rest of life took place. So there's a significant correction that needed to happen in my life, and mainly through the church. My family was very rooted to the earth, and that's, I think, maybe where I got it from. But I think that in some ways, your presence here and Colorado Interfaith Power and Light and groups like Earth Ministry, in a way, you are making sure that people of faith don't deny the realities of climate change, because it's something that we all want to do sometimes, right? And that a lot of people, and indeed I would say our culture in general, is in a space of denial. And it was interesting last night, David Wong, how he once in a while referred back to 12-step programs and addiction, and how I worked with homeless men for a year back in DC once, and in many ways that path is the path to salvation, if you will, because it's so in your face in the sense of not allowing a person to remain in denial, in this case about their addiction to alcohol. But in some ways, I feel like our culture needs to be in a 12-step program that would get us out of denial about the impacts our lives are having on this beautiful gift of creation. And so I think our spirituality has a lot to offer us in giving us strength to face up to what's happening, and then your presences and these groups that I've mentioned help us to challenge others to not live in denial. And then I think there's a rooted identity that our spiritualities can offer us, and I want to go into this a little bit more in depth because I think it's so interesting and foundational. And to get into it, I want to reflect a little bit on a story in the Gospels, the temptation of Jesus. And some of you are probably quite familiar with it, some of you may not be at all. So I'm going to I'm going to read part of this story from Matthew. And again, the question is, where is your identity as an individual and in community with others? So Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, if you're the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But Jesus answered, it is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took Jesus to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, God will command God's angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. Jesus said to the devil, again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor, and said to him, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only God. The devil left Jesus, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. So that's the story of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. And it's really important to point out that right before Jesus goes into the wilderness, he's baptized. And as he comes out of the river Jordan, he hears a voice, and a dove descends, and the voice says, you are my son, whom I am well pleased. You are my beloved. And when I first heard this way of this interpretation I'm going to give you of this temptation in the wilderness, I found it quite transformational and very, very helpful. And I think foundational to understanding how we can become people of greater freedom. Because I think we need to be really free if we're going to take greater risks on behalf of life and on behalf of God, on behalf of that which is needed. And so, did you notice the first word that the devil says to Jesus? So Jesus has been blessed and said, "You're my beloved." And what's after 40 days of fasting? What's the first little word? What?
If.
Yeah, if. And what does an if do? Question, doubt. It creates doubt. And in this case, it creates doubt about his identity. He says right away, if you're the Son of God, well, you're going to need to prove it to me, Jesus. And what I want you to do for me is to turn these stones into bread. And maybe one way of summarizing what that would be, or generalizing that would be, if you're the Son of God, prove who you are by your abilities. Pretty impressive, stones into bread. Prove who you are by your abilities. The second one, up to the temple, throw yourself down. Again, he says if, so questioning his identity. If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down because, you're pretty special, Jesus, at least if you're the Son of God. So, and you're just starting out your ministry, certainly God is not going to let you kill yourself in the temple floor. So God's going to come and save you. So this is the temptation, to prove who you are by the reactions and responses you get from other people. Or in this case, from God. Prove who you are, Jesus, by how God reacts and responds to you. The third one, he doesn't go for the if in this one. He just goes for that jugular that Madison Avenue goes for, of proving who you are by your money, your status, your prestige, your power, your prestige, your positions of power. Because he says, bow down to me and I'm going to give this all to you. You be king of all the world, so you have plenty of that power and money. So think about this in your own life just for a minute. And if it doesn't, in some ways, summarize, potentially, what we all face at some level or another as part of being human. Prove who you are by your abilities. And which one of these maybe is most difficult for you? Prove who you are by the reactions and responses you get from other people, or from God, or your community. Or prove who you are by your money, your prestige, your positions of power. And then notice how well Madison Avenue knows that we face all those. Because we receive 3,000 to 5,000 messages, media messages a day, is what I've heard lately. And it's almost a hilarious question to ask, which one of those affirms your identity as the beloved? Right? And which one says, in some ways, you have to prove who you are, because you're not actually the beloved You need to prove it by, looking a certain way, having a certain thing, blah, 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 and then here's the solution, buy it, and you'll be like that. So Madison Avenue knows these things very well, and notice how entrapping they become for us. Because once, let's say, this is one that whenever I'm speaking is a very relevant example, I think. Let's say my identity was really tied up in how you all respond to me today. Well, for one thing, I might be somehow trying to manipulate the situation to get what I need from you. But I also wouldn't really be operating from a place of freedom, would I? I wouldn't. I mean, could I have just as well said to Elias, no, I don't think that's my call anymore to be out speaking about this stuff. And I'm doing something else with my life right now. And it's been actually a very real challenge for me because after almost, 17, 18 years in the field, the Episcopal Church cut my position and I had 7 months of unemployment. And, was my identity so firmly rooted in being someone who was working in this field that I fell apart, Because if our identity is so tied up in those things, we aren't very free for one thing, and we risk real injury in some ways to our sense of self if we lose that identity. And because I think it's so tied into what Madison Avenue is asking of us as a culture, I think it ties in very much to this whole question of how are we free to live differently and to care more deeply and act differently in response to the call to care for all creation. So I commend this way of looking at the temptations to you as, and if there are things that feel entrapping to you, perhaps they're entrapping in one of these ways. Because let's say I was really trapped in needing to prove who I was by how you respond to me. Well, I've got to go do it again the next time I speak, right? It's what I'm trapped in. And I think one that many of our culture at least gets trapped in is that third one, the prestige, positions of power. Again, David was hinting at this last night when we talked about some of us have jobs we don't necessarily like that much, and we have to go to them because we're spend an hour in the car that we have to pay for to get to the job, and then to also pay for the house that we're not in all day. So it's again that circle, and if it's entrapping, we're not as free to follow God's call in our life. So I think that there's this deep identity actually for people of faith that we are the beloved, and that is a deeply freeing place to live out of. And it certainly seems like it was for Jesus. And I would say, if you look at any great spiritual leader, you would say that person was free in a way that's different from how many of us seem to be free or not free, or more free. They've achieved some level of freedom that we somehow really would like to have. And I would suggest that their identity is somehow deeply rooted in being God's beloved. And if there's time at the end, maybe we'll share a little bit about what feels entrapping to you. What time is it, by the way? Time to change. Is that what Does anybody really care? Okay, I'll just talk for hours. Thank you for that intro there. That was perfect. We didn't work that out today. But, so another, I want to read a little story to you that I think gets at another piece of what I think spirituality has to offer, and that is a profound interconnectedness. And I remember in grad school talking about how we often experience our sense of self as a skin-encapsulated ego. This is who I am right here, and it ends here at my skin. But actually, if you just step back and ask a question about that, well, I actually think of myself in many ways, or define myself as in relationship to something else or to someone else. And there were some great essays by some of my favorite authors like Wendell Berry and Terry Tempest Williams and Gary Snyder about being that we are actually an peopled self and natured self. In other words, I am not just a skin encapsulated ego. I am actually comprised of the relationships that make my life whole and meaningful. And one of those relationships is with other parts of creation. And I want to read a part of a story that experience that happened to me. This is in the book Money and Faith. I spent a couple summers leading backpacking trips, and on one of the trips I was what's called the floater, where I would go in halfway through a trip and meet the group and resupply them with food and gear. So I was the floater on this trip, and part of being a floater is you have to go gather the pack animals, a couple llamas that we had, and load them in the horse trailer and load up the Suburban and drive to the trailhead and pack up all this 180 pounds of gear on the llamas and head off into the wilderness. And I was 15 miles in on their trip. I met them and resupplied them with food and gear, and then spent some time with the group. And then I would float out, leave the group for their last part of the trip. It was toward the end of this 15-mile hike, as I was leaving the group that day in Yosemite, that a transformative moment of intense clarity graced my life. In a way, it was so simple and brief a moment that it is hard to describe. I was simply descending out of the high country and approaching the valley below. We had just passed, we being Alex and Ma, the two llamas, we had just passed through a gray and white boulder-strewn talus field and then a thick willow stand. From behind, late afternoon sun rays streamed to earth. A large grove of young aspen trees grandly and quietly presented themselves ahead of us. Perhaps 1,000 aspens were gathered there, close ranked, crowding the hard-packed trail. None of them measuring more than 2 to 3 inches in diameter, perhaps 10 to 15 feet tall. Touched by a light breeze, each leaf reflected back hues of silver and of gold. As I entered that chorus of aspen tree and color, I left behind all self-consciousness, all worry, all distraction. The leaving of such cares was itself unconscious, as I felt transfixed in this presence, overtaken by beauty and a sudden unveiling of the unending dance and song of creation. I remember that I felt like royalty, almost as if that grove of aspens had parted just then to allow me to pass on the narrow trail. But there was no sense of separation, no hierarchy between me and the quaking aspen. The newness and joy, the peace and kingliness seemed a gift bestowed silently and directly to me from that golden grove. It seemed that their golden leaf garments swayed silently in the breeze as their smooth, silver, slender trunks bowed in respect, recognition, and celebration of relationship. I smiled on the outside and bowed on the inside, seeing more clearly than ever before their absolute beauty and rooted freedom in being who they were created to be. We acknowledged each other. I felt we were dancing and laughing and celebrating. Looking back, I wonder if for that brief moment I was given the grace to see, feel, and join creation's song of praise. Perhaps I experienced a taste of Isaiah's proclamation, "You shall go out with joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and hills will burst into song before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands." The experience was a moment of surprise, a moment of self-forgetfulness, placing my life and concerns in a much larger perspective. For me to be open to such times, whether in community or solitude, whether in the city or wilderness, is to be open to awe and amazement. My response, ultimately, is one of joy, humility, and gratitude. Thomas Berry says that Earth is a reality that is developing with the simple aim of celebrating the joy of existence. This experience with the aspen is one of my most poignant moments of participation in that celebration. My mind frequently travels back to that hike in the moments of timeless grace. Grace because I did not seek it out. It was all a gift. And timeless as only self-forgetfulness and intense relationship can be. So a profound interconnectedness is part of what I think our spiritualities speak to and offer and encourage us to be ready for. And in some ways, I think our only task, if you will, is to put ourselves in places where we're in relationship with, quote unquote, the other, so that they can happen. Because often it's most difficult to feel our connections, to know our connections with something or someone we feel is very other. And so in the wilderness, we put ourselves in relationship in maybe a different way, a deeper way with trees or animals than we might otherwise in the city. Or in the city, perhaps working with homeless men, I had that powerful kind of experience with homeless men, where I realized my connections more than my sense of separation. So again, it was that all I needed to do, in a sense, was to put myself in a place where that relationship could be made apparent. And when, again, that's a time of grace, if that sense of barrier of separation drops and that relationship is made more clear, I think that is a place of great beauty and grace in our lives. I realized as I was preparing then that attachment and detachment are two things that our spirituality can offer us as well. And that might seem like a contradictory thing, but I want to back to this interconnectedness thing. I want to read this quote by John Seed, one of the significant environmental activists of our day. He says, "I try to remember that it's not me, John Seed, trying to protect the rainforest. Rather, I am part of the rainforest protecting itself. I am that part of the rainforest recently emerged into human thinking." Both the interconnectedness there, but also a sense of the self that's much larger than the skin-encapsulated ego. And to get at this piece of attachment, I have a favorite piece by Terry Tempest Williams that I like to read from, and this is taken from Simpler Living, Compassionate Life. D.H. Lawrence writes, "In every living thing, there is a desire for love, for the relationship of unison with the rest of things." And then she goes on to say, "I think of my own, I think of my own stream of desires, how cautious I have become with love. It is a vulnerable enterprise to feel deeply, and I may not survive my affections. Andre Breton says, hardly anyone dares to face with open eyes the great delights of love." Terry Tempest continues, "If I choose not to become attached to nouns, a person, place, or thing, then when I refuse an intimate's love or hoard my spirit, when a known landscape is bought, sold, and developed, chained or grazed to a stubble, or a hawk is shot and hung by its feet on a barbed wire fence, my heart cannot be broken because I never risked giving it away. But what kind of impoverishment is this? To withhold emotion, to restrain our passionate nature in the face of a generous life just to appease our fears. A man or woman whose mind reigns in the heart when the body sings desperately for connection can only expect more isolation and greater ecological disease. Our lack of intimacy with each other is in direct proportion to our lack of intimacy with the land We have taken our love inside and abandoned the wild. So become deeply attached to nouns. And I just can't believe what she wrote. She can say more in a paragraph than I think most can say in a lifetime. But what kind of impoverishment is this, to withhold emotion, to restrain our passionate nature in the face of a generous life, just to appease our fears? A man or woman whose mind reigns in the heart and the body sings desperately for connection can only expect greater isolation and greater ecological disease. Our lack of intimacy with each other is in direct proportion to our lack of intimacy with the land. We have taken our love inside and abandoned the wild. And one of the things I think this really draws into question is how much we are able to become people of place today. Alan Durning, who used to work at the World Watch Institute in Washington, D.C., 20 years ago moved back to his home in Seattle because of a very profound experience he had when he was doing research on sustainable agriculture in the Philippines. And he was sitting, talking to this woman under a tree in her village. And she spoke poignantly and eloquently about how much she loved her home, which was right around her, and likely the place where she had grown up. And then she said to Alan, "So tell me about your home." And Alan's face just fell, he says. And he said, I don't have a home. He was living in Washington, D.C., doing a ton of traveling, writing about world issues, but he didn't have a home like she had a home. And she says her face just fell, kind of out of pity, but also like, I don't even understand what that means. How can you not have a home? How can you not have a place that you love so much, like I love this place so much? And I think many of our best nature writers today speak eloquently of this need to become people of place again. And Durning, in response, moved to Seattle, where he was from, and started Northwest Environment Watch, which is now Sightline Institute. And what he also said in that story is, in America, we don't have homes, we have careers. And we move and move and move based on our career. And that, people can still know and love a place to some extent. I'm not saying people who move all the time can't become active and love and take care of their place. But there is a difference, I think, in the level of rootedness and love that people feel for a place. It's the indigenous people that get up and stand in front of the bulldozers because they know that's their home. And if they don't have that home, they will die. If not physically, psychically, spiritually, because that is so connected to their spirituality. And I just wonder, when I see a salmon going upstream, I wonder how much like a salmon could I become? What would it take to be a human salmon? What would it take to be a person so in place that there's not a question about how I would act in that place? I think those are maybe the kinds of questions we need to start asking more. And then be willing to, people can, I've heard people ask Wendell Berry, well, I don't have a home. My family's moved, I was, an Army brat, or I don't have any place I would call home. I think Berry and others would just say, well, stop somewhere. Let's decide to stop somewhere and move on from there. So attachment to place, to people, things, nouns, places, creatures, but also detachment. Richard Rohr, who I quoted earlier, Richard Rohr says, all great spirituality teaches about letting go of what you don't need and who you are not. Then, when you can get little enough and naked enough and poor enough, you'll find that little place where you really are is ironically more than enough and is all that you need. At that place, you'll have nothing to prove to anybody, and nothing to protect. Gets back to the temptation story, doesn't it? That place is called freedom. It's the freedom of the children of God. Such people can connect with everybody. They don't feel the need to eliminate anybody. So there's this also deep truth, I think, to detachment, but I think perhaps what it is in the face of climate change is as we become more attached and more caring and more active, perhaps we also need to hold lightly the results. Becoming detached in a sense from how we really, really, really want the results to look. And then there's this powerful quote by Gus Speth, who's one of our country's leading environmentalists. He's one of the founders of the NRDC, I believe, as well as the World Resources Institute. Was at Yale, the dean of the Yale Forestry School and Environmental Studies School. And he was speaking to a group of faith leaders. And he had this to say. I used to think the top environmental problems facing the world were global warming, environmental degradation, and ecosystem collapse, and that we scientists could fix those problems with enough science. But I was wrong. The real problem is not these three items, but greed, selfishness, and apathy. And for that, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. We need your help. Speth says we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. It strikes me that at the heart of that transformation is the invitation to live as if we really are the beloved, to live free from the need to prove who we are or justify ourselves, and then to go about creating the kind of economy that does not destroy the integrity of God's creation on which all of us depend in every moment for our health and well-being. And Speth's quote, I think, gets at what I'd like to leave you with today, which would be your importance, our importance as faith communities to hold a light that does not allow denial to flourish, and a light that says we are called to a spiritual and cultural transformation, and that our faith communities potentially together, ecumenically, interfaith, in an interfaith way, have a lot to offer to challenge those idols of greed, selfishness, and apathy, and a strong voice that would help correct the kind of economy that is so destructive of these places that we love. So take courage in the importance of your voice in this movement. I guess now I'd like to say we've got some time to maybe interact a little bit, okay? If you have something you want to say or a question, we can do that. Yeah.
Could you tell us the reference to that wonderful quote you read? I think it was very wonderful.
Yeah.
Could you give us a citation? I'd like to check into that.
So it's in her book, An Unspoken Hunger. And it's from the essay, Winter Solstice at the Moab Slough.
Say it again.
An Unspoken Hunger, Winter Solstice at the Moab Slough. And I will say that a lot of some of what I've read or spoken out of are contained in these books that are anthologies of essays, and they have study guides in the back. That's what I like to tell people, because they're ideal for going through with a group of people wanting to wrestle with these issues and build community while they're doing so. One of them's called Simpler Living, Compassionate Life. One of them's called Food and Faith, Justice, Joy, and Daily Bread. And the other one's Money and Faith, The Search for Enough. And there are copies here and there are copies in the other room. and just a suggested donation as you can afford that. So, others?
Just use the mic. We are recording this.
Kriti.
Thank you. That was really deep. I really enjoyed it. It didn't feel like to me that you were speaking from a Christian perspective. I'm a Zen Buddhist, and it felt like we're also probably talking about Gary Snyder. I guess more than a question, it's a comment. I guess the layer that's beneath denial is usually a lot of grief. So I think we need a lot of help in the faith communities to face that grief. I mean, if I'm rooted to this place and if I can see the trees and the soils dying, if I feel that connectedness that you talk about, there's this profound grief, and I think it's to hide that grief that we deny.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you, Kriti. I couldn't agree more, and I mean, I did write one intro to this talk where I essentially just talked about grief, and it didn't get traction for me, but I totally agree. In fact, and Joe and I have talked about this. I think ecological grief is something that we carry as a culture now, whether we realize it or not. And E.O. Wilson, if I had time, there's this piece I'd also like to share with you, a sermon I wrote very recently, where I get into that a little bit. And in that context, E.O. Wilson says that he believes we're actually hardwired to love life, what he calls biophilia. So if we're hardwired to love this crazy world, then when we see what's going on around it, it's gonna hurt somewhere. And again, I think we could point to 12-step programs. You know, they don't let people stay in denial. And one of the things they also, though, make sure people deal with is the grief that they have caused themselves and others. And they actually are required to go talk to people whom they have damaged in the process of their addiction. And so I would commend to you people like Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R, and Joanna Macy. I have Active Hope in my bag right here. I've been reading it lately. All right. So those are the two I know of that are doing maybe the best work around grief, around ecological grief. And if there's another book in me that I maybe feel called to address, it would be that. It would be to bring together maybe the best psychology, theology, and activists, their voices around grief, as well as rituals. Because I think if we're going to address grief, we need rituals to get it out. I once did a men's retreat with Richard Rohr, and he's brilliant and his crew, brilliant at creating rituals that are acted out in front of other people that embody what it is we're feeling. Because those kinds of feelings need expression, and they can be almost so powerful that we're afraid to go there. But if in a context of doing it in a ritualized way, it's a safe way to address it, I think.
Yeah, I think grief is something that I think all people can identify with and all people can share. And we know from the work that's been done on the stages of grief, I mean, we know that it's not absolute prescribed series of steps or stages that people have to go through, but people are in different places in terms of their dealing with grief. And some people are stuck in anger, some people are stuck in denial, and a lot of us, I think, are stuck somewhere in the grief process. And so for me, as an activist who's participated in a lot of protests and demonstrations, I think a lot of times we're stuck in anger. And when we express it that way, I think we have a tendency to trigger other people's fears or sense of vulnerability. And so I think if, like you were suggesting, if we figured out how to give people an opportunity to engage in public expressions of grief, they can do that from wherever they're coming from.
Yeah.
But if we were able to, and I think that could allow people to connect to one another, even though they're maybe stuck in different stages of grief, we all can engage in some kind of basic expression of grief. This is not where this is not where we think we ought to be. This is not what we think the world ought to be. We have different ideas about, going forward from here, but let's just connect on that level. And let's express our common grief first and connect with each other as human beings on that level. So, I've been kind of toying with the idea of, in terms of public ritual of grief and how that might be able to get some of us unstuck from our different places.
Yeah, and this whole divestment campaign that Bill McKibben has been talking about, there's a student group on Seattle University's campus where I work that is pushing divestment there, and we've been talking about having a public ritual of grief before they go talk to the administration about divestment, and it can be empowering because it helps us move through the stuck place of depression, grief, or anger. And you're right, it's not like we get through it all at once, but having a ritual maybe is one way to dislodge it a bit and move to a place that's a bit more healthy with it maybe. And we're going to get angry and depressed and grief again, and so we'll have to kind of cycle through it.
Well, I just wanted to comment very briefly that I think a special role for communities of faith is public prayer, and that can serve an important function of expression and articulation of grief, as well as looking for communal support and some kind of support from a higher power.
Thank you.
I enjoyed your remarks about freedom and acting from a place of feeling loved and being beloved, and doing that in today's society. And your analogy of being a salmon swimming upstream, of course, feels a little bit like what it is to be free or live freely, because everything in our society conditions us to not be that. And I think we face tremendous societal pressure along the lines of what you were talking about earlier. So I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about how we might be able to shed our fear of freedom and being able to aspire to that in the face of so much resistance.
Nope. Shed our fear of freedom. Yeah, isn't that something? I mean, all right. Terry Tempest Williams, she's quoting Audre Lorde. We have been raised to fear the yes within ourselves, our deepest cravings. And the fear of our deepest cravings keeps them suspect, keeps us docile and loyal and obedient, and leads us to settle for or accept many facets of our own oppression. I mean, that's maybe the spiritual journey, isn't it? To become, as you put it, less and less fearful of our own freedom, to be who we are deeply created to be. And I think that's, again, one of the important roles that faith communities play. Bill McKibben says our faith communities are maybe our only institution left that can posit something other than accumulation as the meaning of life, or materialism as the meaning of life. So when I said, which of those messages you hear every day says you're the beloved, well, none of them do, but maybe if you go to church or you go to your temple, or now and then, you might hear something along the lines of, you're the beloved. There's another identity here. And I suppose meditation and being quiet feels like a pretty powerful way to live more freely, to prayer and a faith community. And I think, again, being willing to be in relationship with the other because the other might ask things of you that you're not sure you're ready to give yet, but it might be the thing that you most need to give to help set yourself free. And again, I think that could be with another part of non-human creation or part of humanity that you're scared of or not sure how to be with. And if you can, it would be great, I think, if our faith communities were more diverse and had people of different economic strata in them and different race and were places where some of that could happen in a really safe place. So those are a few thoughts, but it's a profound question, and thank you for it. Okay.
I find listening to this conversation to be almost unbearably exciting and wonderful for at a lot of different levels of my life. But I believe that there are people today in the world and within the larger ecological movement who are working in very focused, intentional ways to take this matter of our grief at the losses to our humanity and its reflection in the losses that are present in the earth and the waters and the air and the lands, and try to enable people to find new human power and strength and even hope for the hopeless in the process of seeing that reflection. And Glenn Albrecht, who is a philosopher in Australia and environmentalist, is planning a work with Trevi Johnson, who is the executive director of an organization, a nonprofit organization called Radical Joy for Hard Times, that will occur in 2015, in which one of the things we've been discussing, I found myself only in the last 6 months becoming an advisor to the process, will take gathering people at sites around the world on one day. Particularly these themes will be on fracking and oil broken lands and waters, in which they'll use mirrors to mirror the woundedness of the earth with human woundedness, and then pick it up in the imaging of the media that will track it. So this matter of our own brokenness as human beings and our relationship with nature and the finding the power to engage the healing of the earth is really significant. I'm just really pleased to have been present hearing this thread of the conversation. Thank everyone.
Angel in the biblical story means messenger, and most of the angels, if not all the angels in the biblical story, are men. So you will forever be Michael, to me, the angel of the environment and of the sustainability. So thank you so much, Michael.